Please join us in welcoming Ambassador Ross.
So, you know, when I go to shul on Saturdays, usually the first question I get from most of my fellow members of the shul is, can you tell us something good? Can you make us, tell us something nice about the Middle East? And I'm going, look, you want me to talk about the Middle East? You want me to talk about sports? I can say something good about sports. When it comes to the Middle East, it's pretty hard to give you an upbeat message. And yet, the title of the book I've written is called Doomed to Succeed. Now, obviously, there's a sense of irony in the title, but doomed to succeed implies that things in the end are going to be okay. So this may be one of the few times you're going to come to an event about the Middle East, given everything that's going on right now, and you'll walk out of here and you'll say, well, you know what? Maybe it'll be all right. We'll see if you feel that way when I finish, okay? All right, so this book is a book that basically deals with every administration. The truth is, when I started writing the book, I wasn't going to write it this way. When I started writing the book, I was going to write a book that summarized I would say, the administrations before I began to serve. And the only reason I changed is I decided I needed to research a little bit what was going on in the administrations. You need to hear me too? Well, there's two mics here. This one is for a different purpose? Okay, so in conclusion, all right, so the essence of this book, what I was about to say is, I was going to write the book in a way that focused much more on the recent events and the recent administrations, and I wasn't going to write a chapter on every administration from Truman to Obama. Now, I changed because as I began to do the research on the Truman up to Carter, I was coming across examples of arguments that constantly I dealt with when I was in. And I ended up having a couple of wow moments where I literally found not just the same arguments that I confronted, but the same words. And the more I saw that, and I saw the recycling of arguments, the recycling of assumptions, I said, you know what? If people are really going to learn from this, and my aim, obviously, is to affect the next administration, they need to see the continuity of arguments and frequently the continuity of assumptions that were simply wrong-headed. And so I ended up going from wow moments to writing a chapter on every administration from Truman to Obama. Now, I, of course, can go through every single detail with you tonight, and that means that we'll leave about 4 in the morning. But since you might run out of gas by that time, I won't, but you might, so I'm going to do something a little different. You heard in the introduction that I also teach at Georgetown. And one of the things that I like to do as a professor is I like to pose questions. Now, it is true, I never pose a question that I can't answer, but I want to pose questions because it also engages the audience. And I'm going to do it by starting in the following way. In every administration from Truman to Obama, there was a significant constituency in the national security apparatus that believed that Israel was a problem. They looked at Israel through the lens that Israel was a liability, a problem, and they thought more in competitive, not in collaborative terms. Okay, so that's the baseline. So my question to you is, which administration do you think that constituency existed, because it existed in all of them, but in which administration did that constituency have no influence? Have a guess? What do you think? You think George W. Bush? That's what you're saying? that you're thinking in the Obama administration, the constituency that thought Israel was a problem had no weight? Have you observed the Obama administration? I'll give you a hint. It was not the Obama administration. Truman? No, that constituency. Truman had to override the opposition of all of his advisors. Every single one of his national security advisors was against the recognition of the State of Israel. All of the so-called wise men weren't so wise on this. Bush 2, all right, meaning Bush 43. How many people think it was Bush 43, the only one? Very few. Well, it's a very good guess. It's wrong, but it's a very good guess. I'll explain in a second why it's wrong, but I'm going to think about it. It's a good guess because Bush was very much identified as being supportive of Israel. But to put this in perspective for you, in the president's first call to Ariel Sharon after 9/11, after the president had declared a war on terror, which is about a week after this, he is pressing then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon to have his foreign minister, Shimon Peres, deal with Yasser Arafat. Now at the time, there are bombs going off in Israel. He's declared a war on terror. He wouldn't have dreamed of talking to those who were responsible for 9/11, but he is pressing the Prime Minister of Israel to have his foreign minister talk to Yasser Arafat. Now, why is that? I'm going to answer this one. It's because there's a very strong constituency within the administration that is convinced that, in fact, the only reason 9/11 happened was because of Israel, our association with Israel, and the Palestinian problem. Right? Now, that constituency has weight in the George W. Bush administration. Over time, George W. Bush evolves. And he sees, well, wait a second, they're fighting a war on terror, we're fighting a war on terror, there can't be one set of rules for them and a different set of rules for us. So he does evolve, but that constituency retains weight, but it loses its influence. It doesn't have the same influence that it has early on. All right, so which administration do you think it had no influence whatsoever? Reagan? Again, a very interesting guess. Wrong, but a very interesting guess. Any other guesses? Which one? Who said Clinton? All right, everyone who said Clinton, you're right. Bill Clinton was the only administration where the constituency that viewed Israel as a problem existed but had no influence. And the reason was Clinton felt that the United States was Israel's only real friend. He could have differences with Israel, but he didn't want to broadcast them. He thought it was a big mistake to expose the differences because he saw when we exposed differences with Israel, he felt it basically played to Israel's enemies. It gave them encouragement that maybe, in fact, they could separate us from Israel. And he felt this made Israel weaker. It weakened Israel's deterrence. He also thought it made peace less likely. And peace was his priority because he felt a real debt. Clinton, you'll see when you read the Clinton chapters, I know you all will. You'll see that for Clinton, many people think that he worked the way he did because he wanted a legacy. No. He felt an obligation. His first meeting with Yitzhak Rabin was on March 1993. In that meeting, Yitzhak Rabin said to him he was going to take risks for peace. And Clinton said to him, you take risks for peace, and my obligation is basically to minimize those risks. So Clinton is the one administration where you don't see this. Okay, so which administration do you think was the toughest on Israel through all this period, from Truman to Obama? All right, I'm hearing Obama, I'm hearing Carter, Eisenhower. All right, Eisenhower is. We're going to go, don't worry, we're going to go through all of them. Sydney, it's okay, we're going through all of them. I got time, it's all right, All right, so it's true. Eisenhower is the toughest administration on Israel. When Israel, with the British and the French, engaged in what is the Suez War of 1956, Eisenhower actually threatens, at least he contemplates, the use of American force to expel Israel's forces from the Sinai. Pretty extraordinary. He threatens sanctions. He has as Undersecretary of State Herbert Hoover. The only reason it's not Dulles, Dulles suffers a severe abdominal attack during the war. It turns out to be cancer that will kill him a couple years later. But he has his Undersecretary of State Herbert Hoover threaten the Israeli ambassador to the United States with expulsion from the UN. I mean, this is really extreme stuff. What makes it so ironic, of course, this is at the same time the Soviets have gone in and basically taken over Hungary and kicked out the independence government in Hungary. Within 1 week after having made these threats and so forth, it sort of dawns on Eisenhower, not towards Israel, because he still retains the very tough view towards Israel, but it dawns on him that all the pressure he put on the British and the French to stop has actually now created a vacuum in the Middle East. And he goes and he visits Dulles in the hospital, and he's written out by hand a page and a half of notes, and he says, this is after he's basically stopped oil shipments to the British and the French, put a hold on a $1 billion loan to the British that they desperately needed, and 1 week later he's sort of saying, gee, I hope when Anthony Eden comes over here, he'll be prepared to join with us against the bear, meaning the Soviets, because it dawns on him he's just created a vacuum in the Middle East. Within 6 weeks, he comes out with what is known as the Eisenhower Doctrine, where he is prepared to go ahead and offer assistance to any country in the region that feels they're being threatened by the Soviets or the Soviet proxies, with one exception: Israel. So yes, this is the toughest administration on Israel, but it's not the only administration that suspends weapons as a punishment to Israel. Now, the reason it couldn't be the only administration that suspends weapons as a punishment is because he wouldn't provide any weapons to Israel. When the Israelis were requesting arms, at a time when the Soviets were providing arms to Egypt, to Syria, and after the coup in 1958 in Iraq, his answer and Dulles' answer to the Israelis was, you should depend on the goodwill of your neighbors. Now, at the time, the goodwill of the neighbors, every single Israeli neighbor at that time rejected Israel's existence, denied its existence, and was, sworn to try to do away with Israel. But according to the Eisenhower administration, Dulles, Israel should be a good neighbor. I mean, exactly how they were supposed to be a good neighbor wasn't clear, but that was the Eisenhower view. But as I said, Eisenhower was not the only, it did not suspend arms shipments to the Israelis as a punishment because it didn't provide any arms. There is one administration that suspended arms shipments to the Israelis as a punishment. Anybody have a guess as to who that was? No. I'm going to come back to Nixon. Nixon does suspend arms shipments. Again, when you read the Nixon chapter, you'll learn all about this. Again, I'll come back and we'll have a quiz. So there is one administration that suspends arms shipments to Israel as a punishment. Reagan. It is Reagan. Reagan does it twice. First, he does it in response to the Israelis attacking the Osirak reactor within Iraq, which in his diary, he doesn't question what the Iraqis were up to, and he even begins to think, maybe the Israelis were justified, but he was under great pressure from Caspar Weinberger to penalize the Israelis severely. He suspends, and these are F-16 sales that he suspends to Israel. And he suspends them again after the suspension has been lifted in December of 1981, when Menachem Begin extends Israeli law and administration to the Golan Heights. Now, the Reagan administration, I just described them as being the only administration that suspends arms shipments to the Israelis as a punishment. And yet the Reagan administration is probably the transformative administration when it comes to Israel. Reagan, starting in the end of 1983, after the Syrian effort to subvert with Soviet support the May 17th agreement in 1983. As you recall, there was a war in Lebanon. George Shultz, the Secretary of State, negotiated something called the May 17 agreement, in which the Israelis agreed that they would withdraw from Lebanon if Syria would as well. In September of '82, after the Israelis had destroyed 88 Syrian planes and lost none, and basically cut the Beirut-Damascus highway and was surrounding Beirut, the Syrians had committed to the Saudis that they would get out of Lebanon if Israel would. By May, things had changed dramatically because in the interim, the Soviets had not only rebuilt all the forces lost by the Syrians, the Soviets had begun to deploy the SAM-5 missile and other significant equipment to the Syrians. The Syrians at this time had Hezbollah, who they were beginning to use along with other militias against us. And when the Syrians began to see that basically they couldn't be, they had a strong, I will describe it as a great deal of leverage, their position changed. The Soviets were backing them, and Reagan went back to his roots. Reagan wrote in his diary during what was the fight over AWACS, in which he makes some very tough statements. He says, don't those, meaning the Israelis and the Jewish groups in this country, don't they realize they have the best friend they've ever had in the White House? Well, at that time they didn't realize that, but Reagan himself did have an emotional connection to Israel because, during World War II, he was responsible for doing training films. In that role, he was among the first to see the films of the liberation of the death camps. And he was so horrified by what he saw, he kept the films. He told George Shultz later that he kept them because he felt, this was so horrible, he thought no one would really believe it, and you had to have the film proof of it. And this created for him an emotional connection to Israel. Didn't mean that there weren't differences with Israel, but starting from 1983 on, he goes back to his roots, and he establishes what is, in fact, for the first time, an institutional structure for cooperation with Israel on military sharing, military service to military service, the Pentagon to the Israeli Defense Ministry, intelligence cooperation. Across the board, there is a structure created where Israel, for the first time, is actually seen as a strategic partner that is an asset to the United States. So we shouldn't only be committed to Israel because it shares our values, but because it has something to contribute to our security. And that is a product of the Reagan administration. And there's one other key turning point in the Reagan administration. The Reagan administration is the first administration to have a countervailing constituency to the one I described. I said every administration has had a constituency that believed that Israel was a problem. Starting in the Reagan administration, for the first time, there is a countervailing constituency of experts who see Israel as an asset, who think the way to deal with Israel is as a partner, to be collaborative with Israel, both because it's in our interest, and actually if you want Israel to be responsive to us on things that matter to us, if we are collaborative with Israel, if we treat them as a partner, we will find that they will become more responsive to us. So Reagan represents this kind of interesting duality of, on the one hand, the only administration to suspend weapons as a punishment, on the other hand, the transforming administration, both in terms of institutional architecture, which is then built on by every succeeding administration, even those presidents who don't have the same emotional attachment, and also significantly because now you have a body of expertise that finds its way into the bureaucracy that sees Israel in very different circumstances. All right? So this is a very significant turning point. Now, the constituencies that see Israel as a problem, as I said, they exist to today. In answer to the first one who said Obama's the first one where the constituency had no weight, no, they have weight. And there are assumptions that have guided that group from Truman until today. Three stand out. The first is, and there's a correlation, they're interrelated. The first is that if you want to do well with the Arabs, you have to distance yourself from the Israelis. 5 administrations, by the way, have operated on that premise. The Eisenhower administration, the Nixon administration, the Carter administration, Bush 41, and Obama. You have to distance yourself from the Israelis, and you'll gain with the Arabs, right? And this is a deeply embedded set of assumptions that still exists. Completely wrong-headed. I'll give you, again, because I don't want to overstay my welcome. You'll decide when I've overstayed my welcome. I want to give you, since you raised your hand about Nixon as being the one who suspended arms shipments, I'm going to give you an example of how far we went in terms of trying to distance from Israel and the expectation we would gain with the Arabs. Nixon suspends F-4 Phantoms to Israel in the spring, basically end of February, early March of 1970, at the very moment that the Soviet Union, for the first time in its history, is shipping its military personnel, not only its weapons, its military personnel to Egypt. Now, if you think that President Obama is being passive in Syria today in the face of what Putin is doing, consider that the first time they shipped personnel out, and by the way, many more than are in Syria today, 10,000. It grows to 20,000, but they send 10,000 in the spring of 1970. At that very moment, we suspend the F-4s to the Israelis because we're going to reach out to Nasser. And so Nixon goes ahead and he sends his Undersecretary of State, Joe Sisko, to see Nasser right after we've done this because, by the way, we're going to get rewarded for doing this, right? And what do you think Nasser's response is? I'm going to use a diplomatic term for it. He blows them off. Every time we try to distance from Israel with an expectation that it's going to produce a response from the Arabs, it never does. You can't find a single example. When you read the book, as you all will, when you read the book, you're going to see there are countless examples of efforts of this, and the most amazing thing is there's no learning. I mean, one of the reasons I wrote this book was to expose the absence of the learning. It wasn't just that I was confronting these things in my different administrations. It's the reality that the absence of learning is striking, even when you have these kinds of stark examples. So that's one example of this. How about an example of the second assumption? The second assumption is a corollary. Okay, if you distance yourself from Israel, you'll gain with the Arabs. Not true, but nobody tends to learn that. The corollary is, if you cooperate with Israel, you'll lose with the Arabs. So why don't I give you an example that is as striking as the one I just gave you. So the first president to sell arms to Israel is John Kennedy. And the arms he sells are Hawk anti-aircraft missiles. Now, Dean Rusk, who's the Secretary of State, says this would set a terrible precedent, and it will gravely damage our relations with the Arabs. If I were to cite for you the cables that were coming in from all the ambassadors in the region who were describing how catastrophic this would be, you would find them nothing short of remarkable for their hyperbole, if nothing else. But so Dean Rusk says, sets a terrible precedent, and it's going to gravely damage our relations with the Arabs. So the day the news of the sale comes out happens to be the day that Dean Rusk is meeting with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia in New York, the opening of the UN General Assembly. Crown Prince Faisal, who in fact is the actual leader at the time. It was King Saud, but the real leader at the time happens to be Crown Prince Faisal. And what does he focus on in the meeting with Dean Rusk? Does he focus on the arms to Israel, which is after all supposed to cause grave damage? No, he doesn't focus on the arms to Israel. He focuses on the coup in Yemen that is backed by Nasser, because he sees that as a grave threat to Saudi Arabia. 1 week later, when Faisal meets President Kennedy, does he focus on the arms to Israel? No, he focuses on our economic assistance to Egypt, which he says is freeing the Egyptians up to use their military forces to threaten Saudi Arabia from Yemen, to change the balance of power in the region, and to destabilize all the monarchies. So our outreach to Egypt is seen as the threat, not the arms to Israel. Now, when I say the outreach to Egypt is seen by the Saudis as a threat, and that's what they complain about, does that sound familiar to you? In writing this book, I constantly, in each chapter, I will cite the echoes that you'll hear in the future. This one you hear right now. Just substitute Iran for Egypt, and that's the conversation the Saudis have been having with the Obama administration. And why? They say you do the nuclear deal with Iran, and you're going to provide sanctions relief, which will provide dramatically more money to Iran. And what will they do with that dramatically more money? They will cause a whole lot more trouble in the region. Consistently, what has driven the Arabs in their relationship with us is their preoccupation with their own security. What is the threat to their security? It comes from within the region. It comes from the intra-regional competition. In the 1950s and 60s for the Saudis and the Jordanians, it was Nasser. Today, it's Iran. It is the regional threat, the intra-regional threat that is their focus. It is their security and their survival that matters. What matters to them is that we are reliable and we provide the ultimate guarantee for their security. When we're not reliable, it raises questions in their mind. They will not make their relationship with us dependent on their relationship, on our relationship with Israel, because frankly that would mean that they lose us as a guarantor of their security. So they haven't done it. And throughout the history, from the beginning until now, we've seen this. If I had gone back and I had started with Truman, all the expectations were that, and the reason why all of the wise men opposed recognition of Israel was because it was going to destroy our position with the Arabs. And the Saudis were going to stop selling us oil. And what do the Saudis do after we do this? They actually move closer to the United States, and they actually put Americans in Aramco at the time. Every time this argument is made, we see the exact opposite, and the lessons aren't learned. What about the third assumption? The assumption that if you could just solve the Palestinian issue, solve the Arab-Israeli issue, everything would be fine with the American position in the region. It sounds credible, right? Right? So today, if we had divine intervention and suddenly there was no more conflict with the Israelis and the Palestinian conflict went away, would it stop one barrel bomb in Syria? Would it stop the civil war in Yemen? Would it unify Iraq? Would it end the ISIS threat? Would it remove the radical Islamist threat that the Egyptians face? Would it change Iran's regional aspirations? Those are rhetorical questions. That is not, by the way, an argument not to try to solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem. After all, you're looking at someone who spent the last 30 years of his life trying to help produce that. I believe we should try to resolve it. I believe it's important to resolve it, but not because it's a game changer in the region. This assumption has been there throughout. And by the way, that assumption not only has been part and parcel of the constituency that viewed Israel as a problem, but even many of those who see Israel in a collaborative way have also believed that that was something that was very important to do. So a lot of these assumptions are deeply rooted, but they unfortunately don't fit the reality. So here I am, I'm speaking to you in a context not only where there's trouble in Israel now because of the level of violence, but also I'm here in the immediate aftermath of the Iranian nuclear deal. The title of the book is called Doomed to Succeed. It's not called Doomed to Succeed, ? And yet, if I had focused tonight only on the issue of the differences between Israel and the United States, between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu on Iran, that in itself might have led you to say, well, gee, aren't you worried about the future of the relationship? Don't you think it's going to deteriorate because of what's just happened? And my answer is, look, this wasn't great, but it also wasn't unprecedented. I said before, I cited Reagan on AWACS. Reagan actually gave a press conference on October 1, 1981, where he said, in response to what Israel and Jewish organizations were doing on AWACS, he said, it is not the business of other nations to make the foreign policy of the United States, unquote. That's a pretty tough statement. If there was ever a statement that sort of conjured up dual loyalties, that is it. And yet Reagan is not remembered as an enemy or adversary of Israel. He's remembered correctly as a strong supporter of Israel. Every time we had one of these episodes, the F-15 sales to Saudi Arabia under Carter, after the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, even though there was a major campaign to stop that, the president succeeds, and there's tension between the U.S. and Israel, and certainly between Carter and Begin. In the aftermath of that, Israel gets $3 billion a year as part of the Camp David settlement. Okay, it was part of the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, but in addition to that, in addition to the $3 billion a year, we also paid for the resettlement of the Israeli Air Force's bases from the Sinai to the Negev. Reagan, in the aftermath of the AWACS fight, where he says that very blunt statement, he's the one who does strategic partnership. And George H.W. Bush, on the loan guarantees, described himself when the Israelis wanted loan guarantees. There was a major campaign in the Congress to produce it by AIPAC. George H.W. Bush says, "I'm one lonely guy against thousands of lobbyists." And what does he do in the aftermath of that? He's responsible for the 44 countries recognizing or establishing diplomatic relations with Israel. He's the one who opens the gates of Soviet Jews to Israel, including they don't have to stop in Vienna, so they don't have to make a choice of coming here or going there. And by the way, he provides the loan guarantees when Yitzhak Rabin becomes the prime minister. We have had these differences before. We have had real tensions between presidents and prime ministers before. It isn't that I dismiss them. It's not that I say they're not important. But there is something much more fundamental that draws us together. It's not an accident that the trajectory of the relationship has moved in a certain direction and it has evolved. The simple reason is it ain't politics. It's that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. It is that we share interests and values with Israel, and the same forces that threaten us threaten Israel. Shared values, shared interests, shared threats creates a set of bonds. Even when there are differences, there's a set of bonds. And now, today, when I look to the future, whatever the difficulties are, compare Israel to the rest of the region. The region of the Middle East where the state system is under assault, you're looking at a reality where the conflicts in the Middle East are so basic and they're so violent and they're so terrible because they're over who's going to define identity. Nothing is more basic than that, and that's why the conflicts are so terrible, why the violence is so bad. We are going to see a region characterized by these kind of conflicts for at least the next 10 to 20 years. And contrast Israel with that. Whatever Israel's difficulties, Israel is the one state in the region that has regularly and unregularly scheduled elections, where the loser accepts the outcome. It is the only state in the region that has institutions, a separation of powers, an independent judiciary, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. It is the only state in the region where you have a very vibrant civil society. It is the only state in the region where women's rights are respected and gay rights are respected. None of that is going to change. It doesn't mean, and you'll see in the concluding chapter, I'm not suggesting there should be no alarm bells, and I'm not saying by the title that you should take the relationship for granted. There are things we have to work at. There are some alarm bells. Israel cannot become a partisan issue. This relationship has to be rooted in Israel not being a Republican issue or a Democratic issue, but an American issue. And anybody who is a friend of Israel is not someone who will promote Israel as a partisan issue. In addition, Israel's values, being a democracy, living by those values, is very important. We are going to become a minority-majority country in about 25 to 30 years. Between Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, and African Americans, they will constitute a majority in this country. Those communities don't have a history of a connection to Israel. All the more reason Israel shouldn't be partisan. All the more reason that Israel's values as a democracy are important. But all the more reason to elevate the distinction between Israel and the rest of the region. I wrote this book to ensure that the lessons of the past are finally exposed in a serious way by someone who actually has been there. I wrote this book to draw the lessons for the next administration I wrote this book to remind all of us why, in fact, the relationship between the United States and Israel is both solidly rooted, but also why it's so important. Thank you very much. I will take questions. Yeah, in the back. There's a mic coming to you.
I heard you say that the relationship has to be bipartisan, yet Israel has become very partisan towards Republican for the past 4 or 5 years under Netanyahu. Do you think this is constructive?
I think anything that elevates the partisan nature of the relationship is not constructive. I think it's important that the Prime Minister does everything he can to show that it's not partisan. I suspect that when he comes for his meeting with the President on November 9th, you will see him reach out in a way to prove that that's the case. I think both will try to mend fences on November 9th, partly because, in fact, now is a time to, I think, mobilize support for Israel given the kind of violence and terror that it's facing. But also I think that there's a reality that those Democrats who supported the president on the Iran deal will also want the president to make it clear that his commitment to Israel is what he said in his letter to Gerald Nadler, sacrosanct. All right, I'll tell you what, one way we can do this is why don't I take a couple questions at a time and then I'll answer. So why don't I'll take 3 questions. I'll take 2 over here and 1 over here. So why don't I start with the 1 over there and then we'll go to the 2 over here.
Give us your take on the Egyptian-U.S. relationship today, the Egyptian-Israeli relationship,
I hear it.
Turkish relationship to other countries?
All right, so the question was, what's the relationship between the Egyptian-American relationship and the Egyptian-Israeli relationship? You added Turkey to that? You could have added a longer list, you know. All right, so the Egyptian, let me put it this way, the Egyptian-Israeli relationship today is stronger than the Egyptian-American relationship today. The President Sisi believes that we have not been responsive to Egypt the way we should have been by withholding arms at a time when he sees himself facing an existential threat from radical Islamists. Obviously, the administration has been uneasy about some of the crackdowns within Egypt, but we did, in the past year, lift the hold on weapons to Egypt. Still, I think that President Sisi sees that on the security issues, the Israelis have been very responsive in a way that the administration has not. At this point, the level of Egyptian-Israeli security cooperation is better than it has ever been in the past. And you also see, certain interesting other little indicators. The Jewish community in Cairo, there was during Ramadan, it's a year where, during Ramadan when people are fasting during the day, this is a time when major sort of television series are put together. And they produced a series this year, unprecedented, where they portrayed the Jews in Cairo at the time of the first war, the 48 war, in a positive light. It hadn't ever been done before. So I'm not suggesting that the Egyptian public has moved from where they were. They've been socialized for a long time for hostility towards the Israelis, but there is something that is stirring there. And you do see sometimes some articles in the Egyptian press that present the Israelis in a different light than you used to see. The Turkish-Israeli relationship is a complicated one because of Erdogan. And I would even say the American-Turkish relationship has become more complicated because of Erdogan. We'll see what happens after the election on November 1st within Turkey. One interesting thing about even though Erdogan tends to be very hard on Israel, it is interesting that the economic relationship between Turkey and Israel has continued to evolve. The trade between Israel and Turkey has grown significantly. It's over $4 billion a year. There are 4 flights a day between Istanbul and Ben Gurion. And if you fly on those flights, which I have from time to time, you'll be struck by they always tend to be full. And by the way, Israeli tourists who for a number of years had stopped going to Turkey have resumed going back to Turkey. They used to go to Turkey in very large numbers. They're doing that again. Okay. I said I was going to take question at a time, which meant I was not supposed to answer your question. I was supposed to hear it and then answer these over here. So let me take these two here, and I'll take these two and I'll hear them and then I'll answer them.
So people ask me, will there ever be peace? Can there be a two-state solution? Will there be peace? And I like to think of myself as a person of faith, but I'm finding it harder and harder to hang on to that faith. And I'm wondering if prior to, say, coming to Messiah, there might be peace.
Okay? Yeah?
In 2008, Omer essentially gave Palestinians a lot of what they wanted, including withdrawing from 80 settlements, maybe a bit more. In 2009, and this fits into your corollary, if we're next to the Arabs, we're ahead, Obama gives his Cairo speech, and in his Cairo speech, he reopens the issue of settlements, but he changes it by making it a legal issue and not a political issue, saying the illegitimate settlements. And what will be the future of that?
Okay, so these are sort of two interrelated questions. One, the first question has to do with the person who asks that he's a person of faith, but it's being harder and harder to maintain the faith that there can be a two-state outcome unless the Moshiach arrives. And the second question had to do with Omer offered in 2008 Abu Mazen a very far-reaching proposal, which Abu Mazen in fact did not respond to at all. And then in June of 2009, when President Obama gave his Cairo speech, he actually changed the terminology on settlements from its being an obstacle to peace to saying continued settlement activity was illegitimate. On the second question, when you read the Obama chapter, you'll see I go through that in some detail. I explain, in fact, it was a change. I explain that this was a conscious effort at the time to be distancing from Israel. I said there were 5 administrations to distance from Israel, always with the expectation that they were going to gain something from the Arabs, or in this case from the Muslims as well. President Obama was trying in his mind to repair the damage that he thought that Bush had done towards the Arabs and towards Muslims. And one of the ways he was going to do it was by showing his identification with their narrative, including as it related to Israel. And so he introduced new language on settlements that did change the character of it. You'll see when you read the chapter that I explained once I got there that this was not a smart move, that if we turn the settlement issue into a legal issue, we would never solve the conflict, that this is a political conflict and has to be solved politically. I go into the administration, at the beginning of the administration, in the State Department, I go with Secretary Clinton because I want to do the Iranian issue. 6 months into the administration, after this, in July, the President asked me to move to the White House to quarterback Middle East issues, and I stay there until December of 2011. And you'll have to read the chapter to find out exactly how some of that turns out. But yes, you raised something that is right. The only thing I would add to what you say is that in March 2014, President Obama presents to Abu Mazen a set of principles for resolving, after 9 months of Kerry's effort, for resolving the conflict that go beyond what we have shared with and agreed with the Israelis, because it offers an outcome on Jerusalem as well. He asks for a response and he never gets one. And that relates to the two-state outcome. Look, we're not at a point where you can be doing peacemaking right now. Right now you have to do conflict management. Peacemaking can occur when you create a set of conditions that make it possible for big decisions to be made. Big decisions are not going to be made at a time when the level of disbelief on both sides is so deep, when the level of, in a sense, of fear and anger is so high. You're going to have to change the climate, you're going to have to change the environment to get back to peacemaking. The essence of good statecraft is, how do you create the conditions for objectives that you would like to achieve when those conditions don't exist? So what doesn't exist today, you got to figure out how you create the conditions for being able to achieve it over time. That's what the task is going to be. I think it's very important for us to diffuse tension, begin to create a set of parallel steps on the ground that can begin to show each side actually proves its commitment to a two-state outcome. And then for the first time, we're going to have the Arabs play a part in peacemaking, because this is something that historically they've not done, but they're going to have to do, because you'll need an Arab umbrella if you're going to be able to produce a two-state outcome, given the weakness of the Palestinians, given the fact that Israelis think that whatever concessions they would make to the Palestinians won't amount to much unless they get something from the Arabs. Okay, so no questions on this side, but quite a few on this. How many more can I take? How about these three? The hands are up. All right, so here. Yeah.
I'd like to know what your feeling is about the deal we just made with Iran. It concerns me a great deal. There's so many people who are influential, both sides of the story. And I'm concerned not only because of our relationship with the United States, but also, of course, with Israel. And secondly, why are we care a darn about the Saudi Arabia? They have none of the rights that we supposedly hold up as so valuable. We don't need their oil anymore, and yet we constantly play footsies with Saudi Arabia. Why? Why?
Okay, next.
I'd like to follow up on the conditions for peacemaking, namely the subject of incitement. Would you agree that one of the principal obstacles that renders peace virtually impossible with Israel and the Palestinians is the ideology of the Palestinian leadership over the decades of complete denial of the right of a Jewish state, and the proliferation of that ideology through their vast mechanisms of incitement in their schools, their mosques, their media, of complete and utter Jew hatred? And if that's true, or partially true, why don't we call it out? Why don't our political leaders, our academic leaders, and our diplomats call it out and try to put a stop to it?
Okay. All right, we'll take these last two. Okay?
This kind of dovetails with the question about the Iranian deal. The other day, I think on Friday, Iran tested a medium-range ballistic missile, the Ahmad, I believe it's Pillar in English. And they also just came out today or yesterday that they have missile silos that they basically say that they have. Who knows what they really have, but that's what they're claiming. My question is, why in the Iranian deal did this administration throw in at the end the 8-year removal of UN embargoes on ballistic missile technology, which threatens us here? They could build an ICBM. And why did they throw in the arms, I forget how many years, I think it's 5 years, that they removed the arms embargo on Iran, and Russia and China are at the moment frothing at the mouth to get in there and sell these arms to them when the Iranians are working with our old F-14s as their air force, basically. So that's my question about that. Thank you.
Okay.
Dan? Teacher voice, go ahead.
I'll hear you. I can hear you, go ahead. Or not.
It seems that the Palestinians have learned from the level of effectiveness of our response to ISIS and to other terror in the Middle East. Will President Obama recognize Palestine as a state? And does he want to, even if he doesn't do it?
Okay, so I'll take this in order. I think when you read the Obama chapter, you'll have a very good idea of his attitudes. In a nutshell, what I would say to you is that when it comes to how the president has dealt with Israel, On security issues, he's been very good, and he would always wall off security issues and say, whatever our difference is, we protect the security, we stand by that. When it came to the Palestinians, he viewed the Israelis as being strong and the Palestinians weak, and therefore the onus was entirely on the Israelis and not on the Palestinians. You'll see that I have a problem with the latter because I think it actually makes it less likely the Palestinians will ever do what they need to do, meaning in the end it actually isn't good for Palestinians. If you have a political culture where it makes it very difficult to compromise because you see yourself as the weaker party, you see a great grievance, and you can't rationalize compromise, if you're always given a pass, if you're never criticized for anything, then guess what? You're not going to take hard steps. So do I think that he will recognize a Palestinian state? I would be surprised if he does. Do I think that he would like to recognize a Palestinian state? I don't think right now he's enormously focused on that issue. I think he's focused on a lot of other things in the Middle East. It doesn't mean he'll never think about this, but I don't think that's what's driving him when it comes to this issue. On the issue of incitement, the answer is we should have been repeatedly calling them on it. It's consistent with what I just said. You can't give them a pass on bad behaviors. First of all, it tends to perpetuate the bad behaviors. Why would anybody change if it's costly to change? If this is the path of least resistance, why would anybody change? We should be exposing it, and we should be exposing it in part because the Europeans tend to be much more sympathetic to the Palestinians than to the Israelis. Now, there are things the Israelis can do to shift the onus, like, for example, make your settlement policy consistent with a two-state outcome. Don't build in what you think is going to be the Palestinian state. If you say for two states, then don't build in what would be the Palestinian state. Build in the blocks, but not outside the blocks. Come up with initiatives that allow you to shift the onus. But on the issue of incitement, the Palestinians have been given a pass for far too long. And it is a mistake not to call attention to it and not to say it's unacceptable. On the issue of the Iran deal, I was publicly undecided. I was quite outspoken in my undecidedness on the Iran deal. Not because I thought that you didn't buy 15 years. You buy 15 years. For real, you buy 15 years. Not because I thought once the deal had been negotiated, you were going to get the other 5+1 to come back to the table. You weren't. And that meant that we would be the problem if you blocked the deal, not the Iranians, and the sanctions would probably erode, and they'd be left with 10 bombs worth of material. I was undecided because after 15 years, the Iranians basically get treated as if they're Japan or the Netherlands. Last time I checked, they're not Japan or the Netherlands. And I don't think you can assume in 15 years they're going to be Japan or the Netherlands. And so I wanted, without having to renegotiate the deal, I wanted us to adopt a series of measures that would have made it very clear that, that we were going to bolster deterrence in the face of the reality that after 15 years, the Iranians could build as large a nuclear infrastructure as they wanted. And they needed to know, and they needed to know now, not in 15 years, now, that if you move towards a weapon once you have that capability, that means force, not sanctions. And it means if you build, if you produce highly enriched uranium after 15 years, that's a trigger. And if you doubt us, we're going to transfer the massive ordnance penetrator to the Israelis and the means to carry it. So if you think that we won't act, guess again, they will. And we'll actually support them if they do. And if you have a surge in spending for Hezbollah, which we will see when they get sanctions relief, we will target sanctions on destabilizing behavior in the area. Those were 4 of the 6 conditions that I had in mind. I had 2 more. I'm on a roll, I'll say them. I wanted us to spell out now what the price for lower end penalties would be. The reason I say that for lower end infractions, they're not going to cheat in a big way. They'll cheat along the margins, if for no other reason than to test how good the verification is. And when they do it, they have to know there's a price. They have to see a consistency of behavior that says when you transgress, the price is going to be real and it's going to matter to you. And that builds up credibility over time, which is what we need to do. And lastly, I want us to create, maybe it'll happen when the President and Prime Minister meet, a joint consultative committee with the Israelis on implementation, because the Israelis have a high stake in not giving them a pass in terms of, sort of skating along the edges of implementation, and also in terms of working with us on countervailing options for when the Iranians do in fact provide much more money to Hezbollah, which I think will happen very soon. Look, why did the administration agree to the provisions on ballistic missiles and conventional weapons? They accepted the argument that those items had been added to the Security Council resolutions, even though they really didn't have much to do with the nuclear question. Now the fact is the ballistic missile one is a little bit of a red herring because there's something called the Missile Technology Control Regime, which was adopted during the first Bush administration, which excludes the transfer of ballistic missile technology. So you didn't need that resolution. You did need the resolution on conventional arms shipments. I'll sign books.
So before you go home to listen to the Mets game, I wanted just to mention just a few things. Firstly, I know there are a lot of parents in the room who are proud parents, but tonight I want to recognize two, David and Linda Reese. Their son, Harry, worked very closely on this book, and with the ambassador, you will find him acknowledged in the back, because they're going to read the whole book, including the acknowledgements. Secondly, for those of you who are wondering why you have envelopes on your seat, if you wish to put a check in that envelope for Jaffe, the Jewish Agency for Israel's Victims of Terrorism Fund, please do so. That is one of the ways we can show our support for Israel. I thank you so much for coming. I thank the ambassador for being an extraordinary scholar, a wonderful diplomat, and actually for sharing a little of his own personal, candid feelings about these things. We are the better for having heard him. Thank you so much.